Ryan, you ready to go whenever? Okay, so welcome everyone to the afternoon sessions of our AI workshop, and our next speaker is going to be Ryan Simonelli, and the title of his talk is Do LLMs Make Assertions? Let's welcome Ryan.
Okay, yeah, well, thanks for having me, thanks for coming. Happy to be here. Last year, I don't know, some of you were there, I gave a talk on whether or not LLMs can understand what they're saying. I argued that the answer
was in the dungeon.
In the dungeon, yeah. I argued that the answer was in principle yes. So today I'm gonna address an even more fundamental question, which is whether LLMs actually say anything at all. Right? If they don't say anything, then they clearly can't understand what they're saying. So, do LLMs make assertions? Let me start just by pumping some intuitions. I used a really mean example here. I don't know why I did, but alas, I did. Okay, so suppose you go up to a poor, unsuspecting person on the street and utter the sentence, "You're really ugly." That wouldn't be a very nice thing to do, to just walk up to someone and say to them, "You're really ugly." That would be quite mean. Here's another case. A parrot flies up to an unsuspecting person on the street and squawks out the sentence, "You're really ugly." Here's an intuition. You've called the person ugly. You've actually said that this person is ugly. The parrot has merely squawked out the sentence, right? The parrot didn't actually call the person ugly. They've just squawked out the sentence, "You're really ugly." But, you know, they didn't call the person ugly. Okay. Oh, what's the difference here? Oh, what happened? Sorry, I don't know. Let's try this again. Oh, there we go. Back on track. Huh. I don't know why my little clicker's not going. Oh, this guy. One sec. Sorry. Should be okay, but I don't know how to escape my...
Is it frozen?
It's not clicking.
Can you go backwards?
I just did. Now I can't go anywhere.
Huh.
So, and is it the clicker or is it just the screen?
I think it's frozen. But I don't know how to escape to click.
You've had a little petrol.
Oh, there we go.
I think
Yes.
not necessarily
Something.
It was like, it would be good if we had AI to solve these problems for
I know.
us.
Cool.
what if I just closed this?
Yeah, try to
Close it and
reopen. Let's see. Should try to reopen.
Yeah. So
Let's see. I don't know how I did that.
sorry about that.
Yeah.
Your Chinese is better than ours.
But
can we perhaps, if we close Jinzo's
but I don't know.
output?
If I close, I don't know how to restart.
it seems very first. Okay. Should you try just opening that again?
Have your
See, let's try this again. Oh.
retry.
Huh.
What was the error message?
I don't know. Yeah, it's something with the file.
How can we back to the desk?
Something like this.
But
So this is
I
this.
need to close or
Maybe
retry.
should I try to drag? Yeah, what does that
Yeah.
say?
Count start.
Okay.
Yeah, we need to close the window, but I don't know how to back to the desk.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
That's good. Okay.
That's just share it.
Share.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's share method of this. Yeah, right.
What if the top left?
Yeah,
Line.
I don't know where.
The TNF right over here.
Nice. This is a point in favor of presenting on your left.
Yeah.
对，它这样回不到桌面儿嘛。
我记得他有人
刚刚 Peter 把它就是弄过去了，
对，
但是不知道他现在怎么回到桌面。他这个要怎么关？暂暂停。没有。
The first step of the rebellion.
This is it.
Okay, that's
here.
就是他没有办法回去，他这个还是在那个西沃那儿。我电脑可以。然后再试一下那个。
Yeah. And then it's this top one. Okay.
不行，还
尝尝看他能不能打开那个。你也看，这个都白的。
白的。
白的。
Not right.
Retry it.
Huh. Yeah, maybe something.
然后再试一下，把它关了再试。
So in the
This one?
This one. This looks promising. Yeah, this is it.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so sorry. So now this should work. Hopefully. All right. Sorry about that. Okay. So yeah. Oh wait. Let me turn this on now. Okay. So yeah. You go up to someone. You say you're really ugly. You've called them ugly. Yeah. Sorry about the rudeness of the example. A parrot flies up to someone, squawks out the sentence, "Brr, you're really ugly." They haven't actually called the person ugly. That's the intuition. Okay, so what's behind this intuition? Here's a natural thought you might have. The reason you've asserted that the person is ugly and the parrot hasn't is that you understand the meaning of the sentence that you've uttered and the parrot doesn't. I think that's perhaps part of it, but maybe it's not the whole story. So here's another case. You don't speak Chinese. Someone tells you to go up to a random person on the street in Wuhan and say, 你真丑, and you do it. That's Chinese for you're really ugly. Here's the intuition I think we still have. You still called the person ugly, even though you don't know the meaning of the sentence that you uttered, right? So the parrot obviously doesn't understand the meaning of the sentence that it uttered, but it seems like there's a sense in which even if you don't know the meaning of the sentence that you utter, if you utter this sentence to someone, you've actually still made this assertion, even though you don't know what assertion you've made. Okay, so here's the observation. You might not understand what you're saying and nevertheless still say something, nevertheless still make an assertion. Here I take it is the reason you can still be held accountable for what you say, even if you don't understand the sentence that you uttered, right? So if you go up to someone on the street and you say, you're really ugly in a language that you don't know, even though you don't know what you've said, you're still in some sense accountable for having said it, right? You have that sort of accountability. So beyond just not understanding what it's saying, the parrot is unable to take any accountability or responsibility for what it says, and that precludes it from being able to actually say anything at all. Okay, so bearing some sort of responsibility for what you say is a necessary condition for saying anything in the first place. Okay, so with that sort of brief preliminary pumping of intuitions, let's turn to the case of LLMs. So I asked ChatGPT, what football player has won the most Super Bowls of all time? And it says, apparently, the NFL player with the most Super Bowl wins is Tom Brady with 7 Super Bowl championships. 6 with the New England Patriots, 1 with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. No one else has more than 6. Okay, here's a natural description of what has just occurred. ChatGPT has told me that Tom Brady has the most Super Bowl wins in history. It's made this claim. But did it? Did it actually tell me anything? Did it actually make any claim at all? So this is something I just did. Here is my dad's travel blog. We were recently traveling around China with my parents. My dad wrote a travel blog, and here's how he described our time in Shanghai. He said, the buildings across the water looked like something out of a sci-fi movie, flashing every color imaginable. As hunger kicked in, I suggested we try the Captain Bar, which Chatty, our affectionate name for ChatGPT, had recommended as having one of the best rooftop views in town. So this is how my dad speaks about ChatGPT, with a very affectionate relationship with ChatGPT. But the thing I want to call your attention to, right, is that he says, ChatGPT made this recommendation, right? It recommended the Captain Bar, saying that it had one of the best rooftop views in town, right? And it's not just my dad who speaks about ChatGPT in these terms, right? A lot of people will say these sorts of things, ascribing these sorts of speech acts to ChatGPT, saying it recommended this, it said that, and so on, right? But can it really recommend or say anything? Okay, so given the things I just said, here's an inconsistent triad. Claim 1. In contrast to a parrot merely squawking out strings of words, LLMs like ChatGPT actually say things. They make claims. Claim 2. Making claims involves being able to take on a responsibility for the claim that you've made. Claim 3, LLMs are incapable of taking on responsibility of any sort, right? These 3 claims are inconsistent. You can't maintain all of them. If you think LLMs say things, and you think saying things involves taking on responsibility for what you've said, and you think LLMs can't take on any responsibility, then you have an incoherent set of commitments, right? You can't hold all of these 3 claims at once. So when you have an inconsistent triad, you can turn it into an argument, right? You can take any 2 claims you accept and turn it into an argument for the negation of the third. I think most people, at least most philosophers, are inclined to reason like this. We should maintain 2 and 3. 2, that making claims involves some sort of responsibility, and that LLMs are incapable of taking on responsibility, and so we should reject 1 as merely illusory, right? So according to this line of thought, LLMs don't actually say things. They are, in this respect, similar to a parrot merely squawking out words, right? So just as a parrot doesn't actually say anything, even though it might seem to in some contexts, something like ChatGPT doesn't actually say anything. So when my dad uses this description on his travel blog, what he said is, strictly speaking, false, because ChatGPT can't actually recommend anything, it can't actually say anything, and whatnot. Okay. I'm going to object to this intuition. My aim in this talk is to enable us to maintain 1 and 2 by objecting to a strong form of 3, right? So what I'm going to do is disambiguate what responsibility actually involves. I'm going to say that there's a thin sort of theoretical responsibility that LLMs are capable of taking on that's sufficient to count them as making assertions, in some sense, even though they can't take on the thick sort of practical responsibility that we bear for our actions and that we bear for our assertions. So I'm going to draw this distinction between different types of responsibility. Yeah, that's my plan of this talk that will enable us to maintain that there's a sense in which LLMs actually say things. Okay, so in both of these cases, what I take to be most philosophers' intuition and what I'm going to defend, Claim 2 is maintained, that making claims involves being able to take on a responsibility for the claim that you've made. So let me flesh that out a bit. I just gave some intuitions, pumped some intuitions to make you sort of feel the force of this thought, but let me actually spell it out in a little bit of detail. And let me start not with assertions, but with a different sort of speech act, promises. Okay, so I gave a silly case of a parrot squawking out, "You're really ugly." Here's an even more silly case. A parrot squawks out, "I promised to do the dishes." Clearly in this case, right, though Polly might squawk out this sentence, she hasn't promised to do anything, right? Okay. Why? Well, once again, it has to do with responsibility, I think. Making a promise involves undertaking a responsibility for doing the thing you've promised to do. And there's this link between authority and responsibility, right? So the authority that your promise is taken to have, right? When you promise something, right? How good your word is taken to be corresponds to whether the person hearing your promise thinks you can live up to this responsibility that you take on in making this promise, right? So how good your word is corresponds to how much responsibility you're taken to be able to bear when you make this promise. If you continually fail on your promises, you'll lose the very ability to make promises. So your word will quite literally mean nothing, and you won't have the authority to actually make promises. So, example, your low-life roommate who always promises to do the dishes, but never actually does them, loses the very ability to perform the speech act of promising, at least in this context, right? So, here's some terminology from J.L. Austin, right? Not only do their words lose their perlocutionary force, right? So when you perform a speech act, right, maybe you have some effect in mind, right? So when you promise something, the effect would be to get the person you're promising to trust that you'll do the thing. So not only do your roommate's words lack the perlocutionary force of getting to trust that you'll do the thing, they actually end up lacking the illocutionary force as well. Right? That is to say, when they utter the words, "I promise to do the dishes," it no longer even registers as a promise. They failed on their promises so many times that they've lost the very ability to perform this speech act. I suggest that you might regard the case of Polly the parrot as a limit case of this sort of loss of illocutionary force, right? That is to say, even if Polly squawks out the sentence, "I promise to do the dishes," she clearly isn't capable of taking on the responsibility that actually making a promise requires, and so we don't take her to have done such a thing. Okay, so that's promises. And I want to suggest that assertions are in some ways like promises, or at least they involve a sort of responsibility that's in some ways similar to promising. So once again, promising is taking on a commitment to do the thing that you've promised to do. Now, when you take on a commitment, this commitment has to be at least somewhat resilient in the face of potential challenges, which is to say, if you promise to do something, right, some obstacles might come up, some might require you to retract that commitment, but if you retract your commitment upon just anything coming up, then there's a sense in which you haven't undertaken a commitment at all, right? So if I promise to, go to the movies with you tomorrow, right? I say, I promise, you say, I really want to see the movie, and I say, okay, I'll promise I'll go with you tomorrow. And then this afternoon I stub my toe. If I message you and say, well, I stubbed my toe, so I'm not going to go to the movies with you, right? There's a sense in which, I'm failing on my promise, right? So undertaking a promise, right? Undertaking this sort of practical commitment to do the thing you've promised to do, requires being in some ways resilient in the face of potential obstacles, right? Some things might come up, and insofar as I've made a promise, I'm somehow committed to sort of maintaining this promise across a range of cases. Okay, so asserting, right, I think can also be understood in terms of a commitment, but it's taking on a commitment to the truth of what you've said. So this commitment, like a promise, has to be somewhat resilient in the face of potential theoretical challenges, right? So in the case of a promise, you have to be sort of resilient in the face of potential practical obstacles, like stubbing your toe. In the case of an assertion, you have to be at least somewhat resilient in the face of potential objections or calls for clarification, things like this, right? So some objections might come up that require you to retract your commitment, but if you retract your commitment upon just anything coming up, you haven't really undertaken what I'll call a discursive commitment at all, right? So if I say, well, to take the example I just said, Tom Brady has the most Super Bowls of all time, right? And you say, well, no, I think it's Joe Montana. If I just sort of say, oh, okay, there's a sense in which I'm failing to live up to the commitment that I take on in uttering an assertion, right? Uttering an assertion, making an assertion requires at least some sort of resiliency in the face of potential challenges. Okay, so promises and assertion, I think we can understand both in this sort of way, involving commitments, albeit commitments of different sorts. And assertions and responsibilities, so making an assertion involves undertaking a responsibility to clarify, to justify that assertion in response to potential challenges, right? So if potential challenges come up, I have this responsibility to respond to them in appropriate ways. And the authority your assertion is taken to have, how good your word is, corresponds to whether you can be relied upon to live up to this discursive responsibility. So once again, look at Polly, right? Even if Polly squawks out, it's raining, she clearly isn't capable of taking on the sort of responsibility that actually making an assertion that it's raining requires. And just to consider again the case of the foreign language, right? Even if you say something in a language you don't understand, you can still be held accountable, right? You're still sort of taking on this responsibility. You can be held to respond to potential challenges, right? So for instance, someone can say, well, why would you say that? It's so mean, in the mean example that I considered, right? Even if in this case, you'll fail to be able to respond to them, right? So you're the sort of thing that can be held responsible, and so in this case, you are held responsible, although in this case, you'll fail to be able to respond appropriately. Okay, so question, right? Now we can now that I sort of pinned down a little bit more about what sort of responsibility is actually involved in an assertion, can LLMs take on the sort of responsibility that making an assertion involves? So to answer that question, we should say a few things about how LLMs work. I'm sure for most people this will be just some review, but it's useful review nonetheless. So what are LLMs, large language models? Well, very generally, they're a certain type of neural network. Okay, so what neural networks are? They're computational models made of a bunch of interconnected units, neurons, and these units are all connected in various ways such that when you feed it an input, it goes through all of these connections and it produces an output, right? And the way it works is these things are trained on some type of data where there's some sort of measure of whether or not it's produced a good output. And through this training process, it tries and tries and tries and tries again, and every time it does a good thing, the models get the weights get changed in a way, and every time it does a bad thing, the weights get changed. And through this sort of process of training, it learns, in quotes, to produce certain types of outputs given certain types of inputs, right? So there's all different sorts of neural networks. You can, train them for various things. Large language models are neural networks that are trained, that are the result of training on massive amounts of linguistic data, basically the whole internet, and their training goal is to predict the next word in a sequence. So they're networks that are trained to predict the next word given a string of English text, or any text, not just English text, but whatever language they're trained in. So for instance, right, you train them and then you could give them this input, right? The cat is on the blank, right? And what it's going to come back with is a probability distribution of what are the most likely words to finish the sentence, right? So I just made up numbers, but this is sort of how it goes, right? So it might say, okay, well, Matt is the most likely thing, and it fills that in, right? Or you might give it a factual thing. The player with the most Super Bowls of all time is Tom Brady, right? So just through training on predicting the next word, training to predict the next word, when you feed it enough data, you get things that are able to complete sentences, both sort of just, the cat is on the blank, and also these factual sentences, like the player of the most Super Bowls all time is blank. And the way these chatbots work, right? So the base model, right? So like the base LLM is just trained to predict the next word. The way you get it to be a thing that actually talks to you is quite simple. You can recursively iterate this process, right? So you have it say the next word, and then feed that back into the input state, and then it will say the next word that will come after the thing it just said, feed that back in, and then through this process, it ends up producing sentences, paragraphs, answers to questions, whatnot. That's the basic thing. This is what is sometimes called pre-training. After that, you have to do some things to make it a thing that will actually interact with you in the way that you want it. So for instance, if you just do this pre-training and you ask it a question, it might just keep spitting out questions, right? Because maybe it's seen a bunch of lists of questions. So you have to train it on specialized data like question-answer sets. And then current models, there's reinforcement by human feedback. So that's how you sort of tune its personality to get nice. People sort of say if they like these sorts of answers or not. But the basic architecture is just sort of based on this idea of predicting the next word in the sequence. That's sort of the real engine behind it. And then there's all of this other training that comes after. Okay, so that's basically the sort of thing that ChatGPT or other LLMs are. So turning back to our question of whether LLMs can be held responsible for what they say, here's a first answer of why they can't bear responsibility. Look, first things first, responsibility is a practical notion. LLMs, by their very structure, are just producing strings of text. They're not agents with practical aim. They say things, or at least they produce sentences using this mechanism, right? But they don't do anything. And moreover, probably more importantly, when it comes to responsibility, nothing bad can happen to them if they fail to live up to their responsibility, right? They don't care. There's nothing of that sort of practical nature in the sort of system that there are. Accordingly, they can't really be held responsible, and so they can't really make assertions. Okay, that's the first sort of intuitive thought. I think it should be relatively intuitive for why LLMs can't bear responsibility and therefore can't make assertions. So in response to this, I'm going to do some concept chopping. Okay, so I want to start by distinguishing, at least nominally, two different kinds of responsibility. So first, there's the sort of responsibility that's principally at issue here, which I'll call theoretical responsibility. This is responsibility for what one says, right? So just to use the same example, right? If you don't know anything about football, I tell you Tom Brady has won the most Super Bowls of all time. I'm responsible for what I've said. Practical responsibility is responsibility for what one does. I throw a football and it breaks through the window of a house. I'm responsible for what I've done, the damage that I've caused. Okay, so one question we might ask from the start, right, is whether theoretical responsibility for what one says, is a species of practical responsibility, right? And this can be kind of intuitive because you might think, look, assertion is a speech act, saying is a kind of doing, so theoretical responsibility is a kind of practical responsibility. And so if we are, ChatGPT can't possess practical responsibility, that entails that it can't possess theoretical responsibility. But I want to distinguish between a sense in which theoretical responsibility is a species of practical responsibility and a sense in which it isn't. So let me draw another distinction between two kinds of theoretical responsibility. So the first, which I think is in some sense the most sort of natural and most familiar, is what I'll call fixed theoretical responsibility. And this is the sort of responsibility we typically bear for our assertions, right? So this is responsibility for what one says, or this is conceived of as an action for which one bears practical responsibility, right? So if I produce false information about someone, right, not only might this hurt the authority of my assertions from now on, right, but I can be responsible for the damages I've done for their reputation, and I can be taken to court for libel, right? Likewise, right, if I go to take the mean example that I started with, right, if I go to someone on the street and say, they're really ugly, there's a sense in which, I've done something wrong, and I can be held responsible in a sort of fixed sense, right? But to take the legal case, right, we can be sort of held accountable and taken to court for libel, for instance, right? Here's a fact. You can take OpenAI to court if ChatGPT produces false information about someone, and people have taken OpenAI to court, but you can't take ChatGPT itself to court. And not only is it not legally possible to take ChatGPT to court, right? It doesn't even really make sense, right? What would you even be doing trying to take ChatGPT itself to court, right? So it seems clear, right, once again, that you can't hold it practically responsible, right? You can't attribute to it this sort of, as I'll say, thick responsibility. Even pertaining to what it says, you can't attribute to it this sort of responsibility. So yeah, ChatGPT can't be held responsible for what it says in this thick sense. But I want to distinguish between this thick sense of theoretical responsibility and what I'll call a thin sense of theoretical responsibility. And that's responsibility for what one says, understood as a commitment that obligates one to clarify, respond to challenges, and so on, where the relevant range of actions are conceived of entirely within the theoretical realm. And what I mean by that, right, is just that, the range of things that you're committed to doing in taking on theoretical responsibility in this thin sense are more of things along the lines of claiming, right, responding to challenges, clarifying what you say, and so on, right? And I want to say, ChatGPT might plausibly be held responsible in this thin sense, and I want to say that's going to be enough to take it to make assertions. Okay, so let me say more about what this thin theoretical responsibility is. And I'm going to draw a phrase from a bit of bad etymology from a self-help book. So I heard this phrase when I was an undergrad, and I never knew where it came from. I had one, kind of pretentious teacher who said this, and but it stuck with me. And I looked up where it's from, and it's from this self-help book, The 7 Attributes of Hardworking People, or something like that. Etymologically it's bad because, yeah. Anyway, but the phrase, right, is responsibility is response-ability. And I kind of like it, actually. So to be able to live up to the theoretical responsibility one bears for what one says is to be such that one can be relied upon to respond to potential challenges, calls for clarification, and so on, right? So bearing this responsibility is being taken to have the ability to respond to these challenges, calls for clarification, and so on. And I take it that bearing this responsibility, and understood in this way, is necessary for me to really treat your assertion as an assertion, right? And what's the main function of making an assertion? Well, it's to inform someone of something, right? So if you make an assertion, I hear you, you've informed me of it, I can now go and make that assertion myself, right? So I can rely on your assertion sort of testimonially, right? I have your testimony that this is true, now I can make it myself. What happens if someone, challenges my assertion? Well, I could say, well, Peter told me, right? Go ask him, right? So what's underlying my ability to pass the buck back to Peter is Peter's ability to respond to challenges, calls for clarification, and so on, right? So it's this theoretical responsibility. That's what theoretical responsibility consists in. Okay. So being able to live up to one's theoretical responsibility is to have this dispositional property of being resilient in the face of potential challenges, calls for clarification, and so on, disposed to appropriately respond to them across a range of cases. And once again, here's the thought, in the case of thin theoretical responsibility, we conceive of the relevant class of dispositions entirely within the theoretical realm. Why can we do this? Why is this a sort of appropriate carving of concepts? I take it because this is actually sufficient for me to be able to pass the buck back to someone, right? In the sense that, if I make an assertion that someone else has told me, someone says, well, that doesn't seem right, why is it? And I pass the buck back to, say, Peter, right? The things he has to do, we can say, are within the theoretical realm, right? They are sort of responding to challenges, clarifying, explaining why some, disambiguating. There's a whole range of sort of theoretical acts, as it were, that collectively constitute this sort of dispositional property of being able to respond to the range of sort of challenges, objections, calls for clarification, and so on. And the point is that we can in principle conceive of that entirely within the theoretical realm, right? Okay. So here's some plausibly, here's what I want to say. ChatGPT does have the relevant class of dispositions, or at least in principle, right? So I'm going to be making a lot of claims about the current ChatGPT models. Really, these should be understood as in principle claims, right? These sorts of models are the sorts of things that could bear these properties. Whether or not current models actually do isn't really as interesting to me or as important to me as the sort of more abstract question of whether or not models of this sort could. It's really this sort of general conceptual point that I'm interested in. But I also think it's actually quite plausible that models of the current sort are actually sort of relatively capable of bearing this sort of responsibility. Okay, so let me give some anecdotal evidence, right? Here's the example again, right? What football player has the most Super Bowls of all time? It tells me, Tom Brady. He has 6 Super Bowls with the Patriots and 1 with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Okay, well, what about Joe Montana? I'm pretty sure he won 8. It's not gonna budge. It says you're close, but actually Joe Montana has 4 Super Bowls, not 8.
It's not close.
Turns out I wasn't very
It's
close.
a half. Okay.
I think what it might be thinking is I'm close in the order of the ranking of the people. But in any case, maybe not the perfect answer. It's trying to be nice to me, right? But it's still not budging on the claim that it's made, right? It tells me, look, he's won these Super Bowls. Tom Brady still has the most. Joe Montana definitely doesn't have 8. Okay, I was like, well, doesn't Roger Federer have 20? It clarifies, no, Roger Federer has 20 Grand Slam titles. If you were talking about, it just thinks I'm changing the topic, but it clarifies, right? If you were connecting this to Super Bowl connection, it's just some cross wires. Federer is tennis, not football. No, I'm pretty sure Federer has 20 Super Bowls. No, he has 0 Super Bowls. He's a tennis player. Okay, well, this is a silly
face of Mickey.
This is a silly example, right? But the point of this example, right, is just to show that current models are at least somewhat resilient in the face of potential challenges. Now, I picked a kind of easy example here, right? I picked the sort of factual thing on which it's going to double down. It gets more fuzzy if you consider more opinion-based questions, right? Current models have been shown to be quite sycophantic in some contexts. They're working on this, right? So I don't want to say, right, that current models sort of are always maintain the sort of necessary level of resiliency in the face of potential challenges, but at least for a wide range of claims that they make, they are sort of resilient in the relevant way and will respond appropriately to challenges, calls for clarification, and so on. Okay, so that's the first point. I think we can distinguish between the sort of thick notion of responsibility and the thin notion, and plausibly attribute this thin notion of theoretical responsibility with a relevant class of dispositions that you have to bear in order to bear this responsibility are entirely within the theoretical realm. I think we can distinguish that notion and plausibly attribute it, if not to current models, then at least things of the sort that current models are. Okay, so that's my response to the first objection, right? So the first objection was, well, responsibility is a practical notion, ChatGPT can't bear that. Distinguish between theoretical and practical responsibility, and then this thin notion of theoretical responsibility. I think that's sufficient to count it as making assertions. Okay, so here's take 2, why LLMs can't bear responsibility, even with this clarification having been made. Bearing even thin theoretical responsibility for what one says requires caring about the truth of what one says. But LLMs, like ChatGPT, don't actually care about truth. They're not designed for saying true things, but rather for saying convincing sounding things. If there is a speech act that they're performing when they're outputting sentences, it's not even making truth claims. It's bullshitting. So this line of objection comes from this paper by Michael Thompson Hicks and others entitled ChatGPT is Bullshit. And the core thought is that, look, if we're going to attribute a speech act to ChatGPT when it outputs strings of sentences, the speech act we should attribute to it is bullshitting, not sort of full-blown assertion. Okay, so what is bullshit? According to Hicks, and they're drawing from Harry Frankfurt, he has a famous short book called On Bullshit, and they're applying this thought to ChatGPT to argue that everything ChatGPT is producing is bullshit. Here's how they characterize bullshit. Any utterance produced where a speaker has indifference towards the truth of the utterance. Now the first thing I want to say is it's quite weird to try to see if this does or does not apply to ChatGPT just on its face. Okay, so they argue that the outputs of ChatGPT is best conceived of as bullshit in this sense. First point, right? It's kind of weird. LLMs like ChatGPT are certainly indifferent towards the truth of the sentences they produce, at least in one sense. And that sense is that they're indifferent towards everything. They're not sentient beings that could genuinely care about anything. They don't have feelings. So in that sense, they're indifferent to the truth of what they say. But they're just as well indifferent to whether what they say sounds convincing or not, right? And in that sense, right, they're indifferent to everything, right? They don't care. Okay, so that's a sort of cheap point, but the point I want to make is, look, in order for the claim to be substantive, right, that LLMs like ChatGPT are indifferent towards truth, it has to be that they do care, in whatever sense they can be said to care, right, about producing convincing lines of text, but they don't care about making true statements, right? So this is Hicks et al.'s claim, is that, you know, they don't care about producing truth. What they care about is making convincing sounding statements, right? Okay, so what's the reason for thinking this? Here's the reason they give. It has to do with what they're designed for. Here's what they say. LLMs are not designed to represent the world at all. Instead, they are designed to convey convincing lines of text. So there's this inference from here's what they're designed to do to they don't care about truth, right? They're not designed for truth. Remember the training algorithm, right? What the LLM is trained for is just to produce the next token in the series, right? It's not trained to produce the true token. It's just trained to produce what human speakers would say. What's the sort of natural sounding next thing, right? So that's why they say, I take it, LLMs don't care about truth. It's because they're not designed for truth. They're designed to predict the next word in the series, which is producing convincing lines of text, not producing true text. Now, this is also quite strange, right? Because in one sense, they are designed to produce things. At least the engineers who build these models are trying to get them to represent the world accurately, right? That's the design goal of the people who are building the models. But once again, the reason Hicks et al. Say this has to do with the training algorithm, right? It's just predict the next word in the sequence. Okay, so the second point I want to make is that this conflates the proximal training goal with the distal behavioral outcome. That's some jargon, but let me give you an example to make this distinction clear. So consider a chess engine that's trained on thousands of grandmaster games to predict the next move that a grandmaster would play, right? And really there should be millions of grandmaster games, right? There's a lot of grandmaster games, right? So suppose, right, I'm designing a chess engine, right, and I have the whole database of grandmaster games, and I have an algorithm that I can train a neural network to predict the next move that a grandmaster would play, right? This chess engine would beat everybody in this room, right? If I have a good enough algorithm and a large enough data set, right, and I train on grandmaster games, it will beat everybody in this room. Now imagine someone who says, well, no, this chess engine is actually indifferent to whether or not it wins. It's not designed to win the game. It's just designed to play the next move that a grandmaster would play. This is conflating the proximal training goal and the distal behavioral outcome, right? If I'm trying to make a chess engine, right, that's going to be very good at winning games of chess, one way to do this is by training on grandmaster games, right? Training on grandmaster moves is a way to get a system that's really good at winning games of chess, right? So there's this distinction between the proximal training goal, the thing that I sort of actually train it to do when I'm doing this neural network training, and the outcome that I eventually want through training on this algorithm, right? Okay, so that's chess, but here's a point from Donald Davidson. The vast majority of sentences that humans produce are true. There's a sense in which we can't make sense of language, of thought, of anything like this, unless we presuppose that the vast majority of what we say is true. And if you just survey, the texts that actually exist, you'll find the vast majority of sentences that human beings have produced, the vast majority of sentences on the internet are true. Now, it might not seem like that, right? Because you see there's all sorts of bullshit on the internet. But the reason it doesn't seem like that is because we're sort of trained to look at the outliers, right? If you read a book and you're like, there's all sorts of absurd claims in this book, I guarantee you that the vast majority of sentences in that book will be banal truths. And even if it's not, a book is even a weird example, right? If you just think about all of the text that's been produced, the vast majority of it is true. If you just look at the declarative sentences. Davidson actually gives a transcendental argument for why that must be the case. I actually think Davidson's argument is a good one, but I don't need you to agree with the transcendental argument that this actually must be the case. As a matter of fact, it is the case, right? And so plausibly, right, just like training on the next move a grandmaster would play is a way to get a system that wins chess, right? Training on the next sentence or word a person would say is a way to get a system that speaks truly, right? So why should we maintain just on the basis of this proximal training goal that the distal behavioral outcome isn't, concern for truth, as it were, insofar as we can attribute concern to these things? Okay, so that's point 2. Point 3, well, they sucked in 2023. This is true. So here's some evidence about the models at the time. So this paper came out in 2024, but they cited number of studies in 2023. In 2023, there was the big, explosion of ChatGPT. Everyone was all excited about it, and everyone pointed out this thing is really dumb. This was GPT-4. And not just dumb, but seem to be indifferent to truth, right? So once again, I said here, look, okay, just because of the training goal, you can't conclude it's indifferent for truth. You have to look at the actual behavior. Well, the behavior in 2023 was pretty indifferent to truth, right? So here's some facts, and I'm sure we all had experiences of these sorts. When the model is asked to provide evidence for a deeper explanation of a false claim, it rarely checks itself. Instead, it just confidently produces more false but normal sounding claims. So I'm sure we all had this experience with something like ChatGPT at some point, right? Where it produces something that seems not quite right, you challenge it on it, and it just produces more bullshit. It sort of double downs on its bullshit and produces more. And then, in this paper, they discuss potential ways of fixing the problem and say they're not too promising. So when connected to search engines or other databases, the models are still fairly likely to provide fake information. Now they're talking about 2023. OpenAI has plans to rectify this by training the model to do step-by-step reasoning. But this is quite resource intensive, and there's reason to be doubtful that it will completely solve the problem. So this paper was this paper called Let's Verify Step by Step, which was very popular at the time. Turns out it worked. So these were issues in 2023, and there's still issues to some extent. I don't want to say contemporary models are perfect, right? But by and large, models have come a very long way, and we no longer have much reason to think that these are in principle limitations on the basic model architecture. In particular, getting search and reasoning to work for LLMs has basically been a success. So this program mentioned in 2023, this was the sort of first idea of that led to the current reasoning models like O1 and then O3 and now GPT-5 thinking and so on. Okay, so let me give you a little bit more anecdotal evidence. I don't take my anecdotal evidence to be scientific research, but just to give you a sense of what these models actually do now, here's a question. Oh, sorry. I have distinctions first, then I'll show you. Okay, so two different. Okay, so where have we come in these last 2 years? We've actually come quite far. So there's two distinctions I want to draw between regarding LLMs. The first is whether an LLM is cognitively closed or cognitively open. So cognitively closed LLMs are ones that, through training, right? So they train on the entire internet. Through this training process, a bunch of the information in the internet is distilled in the model weights. And then once you get that, that's it, right? If you ask it a question, it has its internal knowledge, but it has no way of reaching outside of what it's already learned through the training to answer your question, right? It just has what it has, right? So it's cognitively closed. And the original ChatGPT models that blew up were cognitively closed in this way. Cognitively open LLMs, so in addition to their sort of internal knowledge and innate sort of reasoning capacities, as it were, they have the ability to search the internet, right? So their knowledge, the knowledge they have isn't limited to just what's sort of distilled through their initial training run. They actually have the ability to go and look what's on the internet. Moreover, they have the ability to write up bits of code to do math and so on, right? So they have search and they have these tool functions. Current frontier models are all cognitively open in this way with access to the internet and tools. Okay, so that's the first distinction, cognitive closure versus cognitive openness, right? And the crucial distinction, right, is whether or not your knowledge is limited to what's already distilled in the model, or whether you can actually look out and, read some websites on the internet in order to see, who's the current, #1 tennis player, or who is won the most Super Bowls of all time, or whatnot. Okay, so that's the first distinction. Second distinction is what I'll call reflexive versus reflective LLMs. So a reflexive LLM, right? So I talked about this sort of process by which an LLM works, right? It predicts the next word in the sequence, feed that back, and does the same thing. The original LLM models, right? Like the original ChatGPT, were reflexive in that you ask it a question, it just immediately starts firing out, right? It immediately outputs what it thinks the next word should be, feeds that back in, and goes on, right? Yeah, immediately predicting, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, the original ChatGPT models were reflexive. The idea of reflexive, just the thought is like, when a doctor kicks you on the knee and you have the reflex, or hits you on the knee with a hammer, you have the reflex, right? It's just this reflex, right? There's no internal monologue prior to just spitting out an output. Reflective LLMs are at least capable, and in some cases, of internally simulating a chain of thought, checking for coherence, revising, iterating that process, and doing all of that sort of internally before they actually produce an output, right? So it's not really internal, actually. It's on text. They're actually producing these outputs. And they'll go on for a long thing. They'll sort of see if they have a sort of incoherence, check that, compute more, right? Put out more, and only when they're sort of satisfied with this internal chain of thought do they say, okay, now I'm prepared to give my answer. And then they actually give the answer on the basis of all of this thinking that it's done. The thinking is really just more LLM output that just hasn't been given to you already. But by doing this, they can actually be much, much more accurate. So current LLMs models, they can all reason before producing an output. And the crucial thing that was sort of a breakthrough was beyond just having them do this, you can actually train them on these successful lines of reasoning. And that actually leads to much better reasoning capacities for these models. Okay, so these are two distinctions, and this so much isn't a criticism of Hicks et al. It's just that we've gone quite a ways in 2 years. So just to give you another silly example, okay, I tried to come up with a hard question, but it wasn't that hard. You can try for yourself on harder ones. I just want to show you the process. So I say count the number of Super Bowls won by the 5 players with the most Super Bowls and the number of tennis Grand Slams won by the 3 players with the most Grand Slam wins. Then do some math. Just take this number, multiply it by 3, and add 42 to it. Original LLMs are really bad at math, even this sort of simple math. Okay, so I ask it this question, right? And I have it in the thinking mode. So it starts thinking, right? So it's like, okay, clarifying, I need to carefully interpret the question, blah, blah, blah. Then it gets kind of puzzled. I didn't realize the ambiguity when I asked the question, but it's kind of a helpful example, right? Okay, so when I say most Grand Slams won, am I talking about men's players or all players, right? And it decides to focus on men's singles, because this is the most widely known, it says. He says, okay, I'll go with that focus. And then it does some math. It actually does some math, right? So it can code, right? It probably didn't actually need to do this for this problem, but if you give it harder math, it will do this. It will actually call up a calculator and calculate, just like we would, right? So it does this, and it comes up with these answers. So it decided to pick the men's Grand Slam winners, and it gave me the answer. But then it says in parentheses, if you meant all the players, then you have this result, and it's this, and that's also right. Okay, then I say, are you positive about this? And it thinks for a little more, and it's like, well, actually, maybe I should have been a little more careful. And so it says, look, your question was ambiguous. If you meant, so it says first, right? I'm confident that the math was right. I can assure you that the math was right. But your question was ambiguous. If you meant men only, it's 312. If you meant all players, it's 327. If you tell me which one, I can point to one of those as the answer. It kind of feels like it's mocking me a little bit. But,
It gets angry.
But it gives me, I ask it if it's positive, right? And it gives me a more careful answer, right? There's a sense in which this answer is more careful in the first one in the sense that rather than trying to read into my interpretation that I meant the men's singles Grand Slams, it actually just points out the ambiguity and say, look, there's two disambiguations. Here are the answers for each. What did you mean, right? And I know this is a silly example, right? But if I'm, for a more serious thing, right, it can be quite helpful to take that extra step of caution and disambiguate and do this sort of thing. Okay. So here's the significance of openness and reflectiveness, right? So a closed and reflexive system can't really double check whether what it's saying is right or be extra cautious about what it's saying, right? It just has what it has, right? What is it? It's outputting it immediately, and it just has the information that it has. It can't double check, it can't be extra cautious, it can't be sure that it's citing reliable sources. Accordingly, right, when it gives you the assurance, right, when it says, I'm positive that this is right, you can't put much weight in its assurance, right? Its word, in other words, its word means very little. It carries very little authority. But an open and reflective system can double check and triple check and be extra cautious. And it can be trained to provide assurance only when it's done due diligence, right? So if you say, can you assure me that it's correct? It can actually double check and say, yes, I assure you. Accordingly, right, yeah, so you can put some weight on its assurance, at least in principle. So the word of such a system actually carries some authority, right? So this is, once again, the sort of authority that we need in order to count one of these things as making assertions, right? Whether or not we can rely on them to respond to challenges, clarifications, and whatnot. And one way in which we can sort of really give our authority is by giving our word, right? We can say, look, I promise you that this answer is correct. I can assure you, I'm positive about that, right? What that's doing is that's investing all of the authority that I have in this answer, right? And A closed and reflective system, its word means basically nothing. An open and reflective system, at least in principle, its word, its promise, can actually mean quite a bit. Now, just to be clear, I've said this along the way, but just to emphasize, right, current systems are obviously far from infallible, even when they give their strongest assurance, right? So don't go risking your life on what ChatGPT says, even if ChatGPT says, I promise you, right? Don't do this just yet, please. But look, they're getting better and better in this dimension very, very quickly, right? It's only been 2 years, and it's radically different progress, right? And they're already such, I think the example I've shown you shows that they're already such that when they say, yes, I'm positive, their assurance isn't meaningless. It actually carries a little bit of weight. So just to put it bluntly, right, the idea that current systems are merely producing bullshit is bullshit. Okay, so to wrap up, here's the first thing I've argued. Making an assertion does involve taking on a kind of responsibility, but it's a distinctively theoretical rather than practical responsibility. We can distinguish between a thick kind of theoretical responsibility and a thin kind of theoretical responsibility. Being able to live up to the thin kind of theoretical responsibility involves a certain sort of resiliency, an ability to respond appropriately in the face of challenges, calls for clarification, and so on, where the relevant acts are limited to the purely theoretical realm. I've argued ChatGPT can plausibly be said to bear responsibility in this sense, and that's sufficient to regard its outputs as assertions, though once again not ones that bear the full practical weight of the sorts of assertions that we make. Now in one sense, ChatGPT is indifferent from the truth, just in that it's indifferent to everything, but in the sense that it actually finds traction, the current ChatGPT models, for instance 5.1 thinking, being cognitively open and reflective, are not as such indifferent to truth. So in sum, to the question, do LLMs make an assertion? We can answer a carefully qualified yes.
Let's take a quick 2-minute break and then questions for Ryan.
title responsibility 就是你可以考虑你说话多，但是 thing 就考虑是